This is the podcast that we ask our guests from in front and behind the camera, how did they get their foot in the door? What was the key to unlocking their success? What's their story?
Oppenheimer has already won a whole host of awards. It is nominated for an impressive 13 BAFTAs and 13 Oscars. Our guests today are at the very peak of the film industry. They are nominated in their respective fields for the BAFTAs and the Oscars. Hoyte van Hoytema is now Christopher Nolan's go-to cinematographer, working with him on his past 4 films. From the terror of Hereditary to the heartbreaking Marriage Story, Jennifer Lame says editing Oppenheimer was a breeze in comparison to working in reverse on Tenet. And last but not least, the already Oscar-winning composer Ludwig Göransson.
This is a national emergency.
Detonator charged.
We're in a race against the Nazis. And I know what it means if the Nazis have a bomb.
First of all, congratulations. I mean, Oppenheimer is an epic which seems to be sweeping the world, not just the country. It's also one of the biggest films of the year, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's been doing very well. We're both, excited and intimidated.
Yeah.
It's good.
But in terms of, you've worked with Christopher Nolan multiple times. Coming on board for this one, was the process any different? I mean, is there something that you do specifically for each job to prepare for it?
I mean, of course, you do things very specific to every job you do in a technical sense. You know, every film is very different from the other, both subject matter and the way they want to look. But at the same time, I always like to say or think that, when you've done 4 films together, the best prep for your movie is in a way the last 3 films you did. I always think that sort of the best foundation for a good sort of cooperation is chemistry and reference. So after having done so many films together, you kind of understand each other on another sort of another plane. A lot of things don't need so many words, and you don't need to talk so much about certain things, and you don't need to raise so much questions because you know the answer already to so many questions as well. Very often you kind of straight away can dive into the sort of the nitty gritty of it, specific technical challenges maybe.
Sure. One thing and forgive me because I don't, I'm not a cameraman, I'm not a cinematographer, I don't know much about the technical side of it.
Great with the iPhone though.
Yeah, exactly. You use IMAX cameras, but a lot of this movie is very intimate and very close, and I feel like that's quite a revolutionary thing. Is that? I mean, I've never Christopher Nolan's movies and the ones you've done in particular, it feels like that's kind of the first time that's been done.
Yeah, I mean, we have always attempted it in a way, It's and we have always sort of closed in a little bit on that very specific sort of dream we had or wish we had, and that is that IMAX cameras, they are traditionally designed as things to communicate spectacle or to register epic landscapes, and scope. We always believed that that would be also a perfect tool, to dive into the macro and to dive into intimacy and be very small and subtle. And so we have been working very hard on, developing lenses that would allow us, that we could put in front of that camera, that would allow us to get closer and that would allow us to get more intimate. And then, started to find ways to shoot portraits with it. And effectively an IMAX camera is very similar to you know, what you would know in photography is medium format photography. It's like the old Hasselblad, cameras. And you know, if you look at the old medium format portraiture, it has a very specific look to it, and it's a very sort of almost tangible way of photographing. You know, it apart from the crispness, the sort of depth perception is very, very beautiful and very, very lively and soulful. And that's something that we thought, you know, with the same parameters in the IMAX camera, we could very much bring towards towards the IMAX camera, towards you know, our shots in the film. And that's what we've been working with. You know, we started testing certain portraits on black and white in the beginning with Killian, and you know, when we saw those, you know, appear in front of us on a projection screen, they were magic. They were very special. You know, and I always like to say, you know, in the older films, it's the scope and the landscape, but in this film, kind of our faces are the landscapes. You know. The faces is the landscape, and the eyes are sort of the infinite horizon that you would see, you know, and sort of the projection that you can, or the illusion that you can even see beyond the horizon. You can, for me, it's much more about, you know, making people or trying people to identify with the images they see. Ultimately, you know, when you're shooting something for cinema, you know, the last thing you want is sort of for people to sort of marvel over, you know, the prettiness of the stuff you're doing. You want your audience sort of to lose themselves into the film, and
I guess it's a distraction, isn't it?
It's a little bit of a distraction. You know, things can become beautiful, but it's not an objective. An objective is for me, it's always to create a connection between the audience and the subject of the film. You're kind of, as a photographer, you're kind of that bridge. So in a way, you know, you want to look adequate. You want to just be so direct and so pure as possible. I'm always thinking, you know, I don't want to make it, you know, sound too pretentious, you know, but when things are too pretty, I always get a little icky, or I always feel a little bit bad about it. But
no, I mean, that makes perfect sense. Did you, and this starting your career and everything else, just for the people that are trying to get to where you are and become a cinematographer, get into the camera world, what was your start?
My start, I mean, that's a long time ago. I studied film, you know, when I was like my very early 20s. I went to Polish film school in Łódź, in Łódź, as they say in Poland, you know. Very early on, I think it started with seeing a retrospect by director Nicholas Roque, who used to be a DP, and I sort of became aware that, you know, visuals in a film had very much impact to, you know, how you could feel and how you could make an audience feel, or, you know, how you could prime them to really buy into moods, and you know, how you can in a way lose in the atmosphere of a movie, and how that can sort of then open you or close you down to receive storylines or emotions. I don't know. It's just a way that you at some point start looking at films and start experiencing films and realizing that, you know, that's kind of your language, that's kind of your tool, and that started in a way very early. And then, you know, there's a freaking long way to go where you have to, you know, really dive deep into technology and.
Is it always changing as well?
And the technology is changing, but also your view on what is good photography or good cinematography is changing all the time as well, you know. In myself, for instance, in my early years, I was much more, as we would say, formal, you know. I did much more pretty pictures, and I was much more precious about how my images would look. And, you know, framing is, for instance, a thing, you know. If you look at painting, you have a thing that's called the golden ratio. You know, that's how how you frame, when you frame an image, when you put a camera point a camera at something, where do you put things in a certain place on the set, and you're always sort of imposing your studied rule of what is a good frame upon that. But at some point, I think my framing became much more visceral. It became much more enslaved to not so much on how I think a frame should look, but very much enslaved to how people are living through the film. You know, where are people looking, and where should I point my camera at? And that's a, you know, a much sort of more visceral way of thinking about it, in a much less precious way, in a much less aesthetic way of thinking about it. It's much, you know, it's much more, you know, it became kind of much more intuitive, and much more following sort of the feeling and a flow, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Now, I remember seeing the trailer for James Bond Spectre and really noticing a change in the way it was shot and being like, this looks very pretty. I know that's probably not the aim, but the use of shadows, and like a scene in particular that really like comes to mind is when Christopher Waltz, he's in darkness, and then he looks up and his face suddenly comes into the light. I mean, obviously, that just the way where you need to kind of, because it's a James Bond film, you can't go too far, but you really did change the look of that in a positive way. Was that something that you obviously planned in advance?
Well, I said in the beginning, every film is very different, you know, and I think James Bond is a whole different kind of spectacle, for instance, than Oppenheimer. It's almost like you can think of James Bond a little bit as a cartoon character, as well as, you know, the preconceived ideas that people have about this character, you know, imposed a sort of thinking pattern on you, and then what you can do is you can break that a little bit, and you can play around a little bit, and you can push that around a little bit. But I think that our last movie, Oppenheimer, is a very different beast in that way. You know, it's in a way a place where you have to really start from scratch, as well as your subject matter is just extremely. I would say it's a very important subject matter, and a very, very heavy-weighted subject matter. You know, and it's about real choices and real implications to, you know, us today as well, and so you have to approach it in a very, very different way, and in many ways you have to tread lighter as well, you know, especially in your film language, you know, and where in a film as James Bond, it's fun to copy, you know, cartoon things, or have people reveal out of light and in darkness, and play with the film language in that way. But you know, you kind of try to strip a story like this from that kind of drama, you know. I'm not saying that we're shooting a documentary, because we're not, by all means, and we're trying to make it as dramatic as we can, but I feel that, you know, restraint is a very important tool, you know, in shooting something like Oppenheimer. You have to take a breath, and you have to ask yourself the question.
You've worked with Christopher Nolan a few times. How was it collaborating again? Is it like kind of going back to a family? Is it something that you've kind of, if you used to, you know each other's kind of patterns now when you work together?
Yeah, I think getting to learn how he works on Tenet, I was really hoping and wishing that I would get to do another one with him, because a big part of my job is kind of learning how to work with a director, so it's really nice when you get to work with him again. So yeah, that was really satisfying to get to do a second one.
I've noticed in your career you've worked with a few people several times, as you say, it gets easier when you've worked with someone. Yeah. Writer-directors as well. Yeah. Which that must be fun, because I guess, are they slightly more passionate, maybe, if it's something they've written?
Yeah, every director I've worked with just they really love the editing part of the film. I think they love every aspect of it, but they're super invested in the last part of it. And I think there is a stigma that writer-directors can be a bit precious about their work, but I found most of all the directors I've worked with, they're quite quick, and not quick, but they're so open to changing the material, and because they're so close to it and they know it so well, it's great to talk things out with them, because they wrote it, as opposed to working with someone who's a bit more distant from the material, and either they're like too quick to get rid of things, or they just have a different relationship with the material because it's like they shot it and someone else wrote it, right? So it's
Sure.
so yeah, working with writer directors, I love it.
And it's one of those films you think because it's so wordy, it's long, it's got all these, and you just think this must be a bit of a nightmare to edit. But then I thought back to the fact that you edited Tenet, and I think that was that even more complex?
That was way worse. Yeah, that was a nightmare for me, just because it was so many new things. It's like I was working with this new director who I'd never worked with, who obviously I was slightly intimidated by because they're quite established.
Yeah, fairly
Not
well,
a first time filmmaker. So that was intimidating. And also, I have to get to know the person, and then on top of that, I'm doing like 10 different things I've never done before. Yeah. So I think that was a huge learning curve for me. Yeah. So it was really nice to get to do something with Chris that I was more comfortable with, and then also I was more comfortable with him. So it was kind of a great double whammy.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to ask, my podcast is usually about how, whether you be behind or in front of the camera, how you started and that love of. Was editing always something that you wanted to do, or how did it come about?
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved movies. When I was in high school and, college, I went to college and watched films and studied films. And then when it came time to kind of make a film, I chose to make a documentary because I just didn't feel like I was ready to direct a movie. And I don't like to do things if I don't feel like, really confident in it, which is probably a fault of mine. But so I ended up kind of shooting this documentary. I had this idea for it, and I had so many hours of footage, and I just became... I'm like obsessed with editing this 10-minute documentary out of like this 100 hours I had shot of this thing. So I just really enjoyed that process. And there was a couple other exercises we did where we had to edit on a Steam Deck, like film stuff, kind of like change this weird bank robbery scene to like a different scene. And I really loved that. So it was just something after college I felt somewhat confident in, and I just kind of pursued it. I just wanted to like get to work, and I feel like other people wanted to direct or do things, and I just wanted a job for some reason. I'd always had jobs ever since I was 14. So I felt like, okay, I have this skill, I know how to do this, and I kind of just hit the ground running, pursuing it kind of right out of the gate.
Mm-hmm. Is there any advice you'd give to, people coming in and wanting to be editors and getting involved?
People ask me for advice a lot, and so I think my biggest, and I've asked other people for advice, as I was coming up, because it was hard. I went out to LA right after school because most people I knew went to New York, and I'd grown up on the East Coast, so I wanted something different. So I went out to LA all bright-eyed, thinking like people are going to give me a chance, and I knew some, I had some connections or whatever, and like nobody would give me the time of day, or they'd give me some advice like go do this, or I remember one person was like, oh, go find like the next Roger Corman, and I was like, I don't know that person. What do you mean? I just wanted someone to teach me Avid or let me be a PA, but it was really difficult. And then I ended up back in New York. Someone got me, this amazing woman named Jennifer Lilly got me a job as an apprentice editor on a movie, and got me into the union. But it took like 3 years of everyone kind of slamming the door in my face in Los Angeles. And then even once I got that big break, then it was hard to get my next job. And so I think my advice to everyone is just like, don't be deterred. And sometimes the worst jobs led to the best jobs. Like I would be like, oh, I don't want to do this. But then through that job, I met someone else that it was a great job. So, obviously you have to say no sometimes, but I do think it's good when you're younger to try to say yes to a lot.
I guess, yeah, you never really know. But I mean, you're at the point now you probably would say no to most things and then, pick and choose what you do. Is that that must be great to be able to be at a level where you can kind of choose what you want to do. I'm presuming, but at your level, that must be the case.
It's so funny because it really wasn't, even after Tenet, because then the pandemic happened, I was like, shit, I need a job. And like, this movie didn't even come out, really. So I was panicked even after Tenet. So I honestly feel like this is maybe the first time, although we just had the strikes and everything, so things are getting slow to turn up, but you never feel totally settled. Like there's still in the back of my mind like, what's my next job gonna be? Because being a freelancer is hard, so I don't think that ever truly goes away. I swear to God.
Oh, good.
Like I still have panic attacks.
That totally. It makes sense, doesn't it? It's such a volatile, and it's just one of those industries. I'm an actor, so I feel the pain.
No, it really never goes away. It's crazy.
Yeah, I've been doing this like 17 years now, and it's one of those things that obviously doing a podcast and things like that is great because I get to talk to people like you.
Yeah.
but it is that thing of like fill the gaps as well. Otherwise, you get a bit mad.
Totally.
Do you have like coping mechanisms in between jobs? Do you have things that you do?
I think for me, I love reading. I love going to see movies, and I love. I have kids now, and just like seeing my friends, because you know when I'm working, as you know, as an actor working on a movie, like you really don't have much. The hours suck. So I've really tried to train myself to be like, even though I get panicked that I'm never going to work again, I really try to enjoy the time off, because we don't get, like our job's one of the downsides, and there's a lot of upsides, but one of the downsides is like, we don't get like typical vacation, right? Like I don't just get to say like, I'm going to take 4 weeks off this summer. If I get a job, I have to work the job. So when we don't have a job, you really need to not stress. But honestly, it hasn't been since the last like year or two. I haven't been able, I mean, even... It's a really hard thing when you're not working to not just be panicked about not working.
I think you're going to be all right. I think you'll be all right. You'll be all right. In terms of, obviously, you've done so many different jobs that are just completely different. Like to cite, obviously, Tenant, then Marriage Story, which is, it's just like those two things are just so different. What is the process and what is the kind of difference between those two things when it comes to actually editing them?
I think what I've learned, because I did work kind of for one director quite a long time, Noah Baumbach, and we had like a really great rhythm and method of working. And then when I started working with other directors in between his films and stuff like that, I would try to kind of apply that method, and it never really worked. And it actually always kind of messed me up a little bit, because then I would have to like walk back from them and be like, okay, this isn't working. So I did finally realize, I think later on, that like not to do that, right? And just meet the director, even though it's terrifying not to have like your methods. A lot of times I think those were antithetical to the process, which is just like every director has their own kind of way of thinking, their own process, their own relationship to making films, and you kind of have to use your kind of skills, and I have all these different processes now, but mold into that world. So I think I've learned you have to be really malleable, as opposed to have like a thing you do.
Sure. And to compare those, I mean, Marriage Story, I absolutely love that film, and obviously loved Oppenheimer as well. I mean, I know nothing about editing, to admit that, but in terms of the way they're edited, there's still that feeling of like impending, like sort of dread and doom. It's kind of hanging over the film almost, that you know something's going to go wrong.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a mixture of all the elements, but I really felt it in Marriage Story particularly, which is funny because it kind of gets claustrophobic.
Yeah,
and,
totally.
It's I absolutely love that film. But I mean, they are so different.
Yeah.
So I mean, coming in and working not only with a different director, but a completely like huge scale, everything's shot on IMAX. It's all kind of quite epic and everything else. I guess at the end of the day, though, you're still in a room, on a computer editing. It's kind of still the same
those
thing.
things all stay the same.
Which is mad.
Yeah,
which is
it
crazy.
is mad. It is true.
And Chris invites me to a bunch of screenings. So they have the costume tests, they do different camera tests, they do visual effects experiments, and all the screens are in the IMAX theater. So I'm sitting there, reading the script, looking at these like incredible images. I remember seeing the Picasso painting on like a huge IMAX screen. These like molecules like swirling around, like fire coming around. There was also a meeting where you had like a physicist talk about splitting the atoms, and which was a little abstract, but it all helps with getting the inspiration and putting myself into Oppenheimer's mind, and really a lot of the music and a lot of the sound world comes together before we start shooting the film.
It really feels, I really noticed when I was watching it, there was, all the elements obviously, but the music in particular, it felt like it was building this sense of dread when it was coming up to the sort of the climax of the film. It's something that you, unless you really think about it, you're like, why am I feeling so on edge? But it's all those elements, but I mean, the music really felt like it played a part in that. Was that an intentional thing to just slowly kind of make the audience feel more and more uncomfortable as it got to the kind of...
The bomb, they're hoisting up in the air, and the music is just like this thumping bass and like a metallic ticking and this radioactive kind of sound effects. And that, I think, that very much adds on to like the tension. But also like we couldn't have that earlier. Like you have to earn that moment, you know.
What's I mean, you've had a long career of amazing achievements, amazing films. What's it like coming onto it for the first time when you worked with Christopher Nolan on Tenet? Was that kind of, it must have been a really big moment. Was it intimidating? I mean, the scores to his previous films before that have been epic, and was that kind of a mad moment?
Yeah, no, it was a mad moment. It was very intimidating. And like you said, like all of his scores up until those, all of his scores have been monumental in terms of, you know, look at how they affected the whole film industry and how they affected all the music for all the films.
Every trailer now has that.
Every trailer, every action film has been based of the Batman scores, and you know, so I knew. But it was also intimidating, but it was also very, very, very exciting because to get an insight in his vision and to get to understand the way he works and the way he thinks about music and the way he uses music in his storytelling, I was very curious and very excited to get in on that process.
How did your career begin? Like, where did that love of, how did you get into music? How did that start?
I got into music in a bit. My dad is a guitar teacher, so when I was about 6 or 7 years old, he gave me a little travel guitar, like a small electric guitar, and we started sitting down 10 minutes every day and play a little bit of music. And then it wasn't until I was 9 years old when I heard Metallica for the first time, where I was like, okay, I want to do this full time. And I started learning all the Metallica songs. And because I already knew how to play guitar, I was able to just sit there and just learn all these songs. And then it got into like, I wanted to be the best guitar player in the world. But then I also discovered jazz, and then I discovered classical music, and then I got an opportunity in high school to write music for orchestra. And that was a very crazy, visceral moment to sit there in a concert hall and hearing your music being performed by a 70-piece orchestra. And I was thinking about like how can I do this again, and I always loved writing and producing different genres of music, and I figured also in the films, depending on what style of film it is, you can kind of work around with any kind of genre. And then I remember as a kid when I watched Kill Bill for the first time, it was like that part of the score when you heard that lady, because that was a nurse whistling, that turns into score, and that was also kind of
the music
crazy.
In that film is mad.
Yeah.
It's really unique, isn't it?
It is very unique. After college, I did jazz performance major in Stockholm at the Royal College of Music, and then after that I moved to LA to do 1 year of school at USC. And that's where I met Ryan Coogler, who was the director at the USC, and we started working together. I scored his short films, and I got a job right after USC as an assistant for a composer named Theodore Shapiro. I worked for him for 3 years, and he got me a job for this TV show called Community, and that's where I met Childish Gambino. And so then Childish Gambino and then Ryan Coogler were like two main collaborators in the beginning, and we're still working today.
Wow.
That's happening, isn't it?
The world will remember this day. Our work here will ensure a peace mankind has never seen. Until somebody builds a bigger one.
You are the man who gave them the power to destroy themselves. And the world is not prepared.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3,
Truman needs to know what's next.
2,
What's next?
1.
Thank you to our guests, and thank you to Organic PR. As always, thank you to our sponsor, BetterHelp.